Hi there. Good to see you again. Wow, there's a lot of you out there today. Hey, can you guys in the front make a little room for the people in the back so that they can see? Turn around. You make sure everybody can see. Okay, that's better. All right. This video is going to be about neurotransmitters and what happens in the synapse. So the synapse is the gap between two neurons, as you all know, and there's a lot of stuff that goes on there. When people take medications for things like depression or ADHD, those medications are probably doing their work in the synapse. When people are addicted to drugs like cocaine or heroin, those drugs are doing their work in the synapse. So we need to know what exactly is going on there and how that process works. So the first thing we need to look at, okay, this is unbelievably low tech. I wish I had some more high-tech skills, but I don't, so this is what we have to do. The first thing we want to look at is what is the synapse, okay? So the synapse is this tiny gap between two neurons. So this is one neuron, this is the end of the axon, and the electrical impulse comes down the axon to the end, which is called the terminal branch, or sometimes the axon terminal. And when the electrical impulse comes down, these little vesicles, these little circles with pink dots in them, the pink dots are neurotransmitters. So the vesicles release the neurotransmitter into the synapse. Okay, so this tiny little gap. So at the bottom here, this is another neuron. This would be the dendrite of another neuron. So the axon comes down, there's a tiny gap, and then there's the dendrite of another neuron. So when a neurotransmitter is released, it travels the gap and it binds to a receptor site. So as you can see, the little pink dots are falling into their little receptor sites. And when enough of them fall in there, the second neuron will fire a new electrical impulse. By the way, the electrical impulse coming down here, it's called the action potential. So the action potential comes down, the neurotransmitter goes across, and then the next neuron fires or sends a new electrical impulse. Okay, I think that's pretty easy to understand. But what we need to know next is what are some of the main neurotransmitters? Okay, so there's some neurotransmitters where they know these neurotransmitters are linked to certain psychological disorders or medical disorders or illnesses. Now, before I tell you what they are, you should know that this is all kind of a new science, that this research on neurotransmitters and how they affect behavior has really been going on for, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, but they're still coming up with new findings about how they work because the brain is really complex. I'm going to give you a very simplified explanation of what happens in the synapse, and if you like it, if you're interested, then this field of science and this field of psychology is wide open. There's tons of work to be done, so you could go into that field and you could really have a major impact. Okay, what are some of the important neurotransmitters? One of them is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is linked to muscle movement and memory, and they've found that people with Alzheimer's disease have lower levels of acetylcholine. So somehow acetylcholine is linked to Alzheimer's disease, and you should remember that link. You can remember because it's the neurotransmitter that starts with A, and Alzheimer's starts with A, so there you go. Another important neurotransmitter is dopamine, and dopamine they have found is linked to learning, attention, emotion, and movement. So if you have too much dopamine, that is linked to schizophrenia, and if you don't have enough, it's linked to Parkinson's disease. So I'm using the word linked because we don't know exactly what goes on and how it all works, but they know there's a link between dopamine levels, too high, schizophrenia, too low, Parkinson's. Okay. Another one that's important is serotonin. Serotonin is related to mood regulation. So when somebody has too little serotonin, that's linked to being depressed. Okay, so too little serotonin is linked to depression. We'll come back to that one in a little bit. Another one we need to know is endorphins. Endorphins are neurotransmitters that are linked to pain control and pleasure. So if you break your arm, you're in a lot of pain, and you go to the emergency room and it's taking a long time to get in, well, your brain is going to release endorphins that they're going to help you control that pain. So actually the pain sort of goes away after time, and you don't feel quite as bad as when you first broke your arm. That's because of endorphins. So I want to talk about those four. Those are the main ones that you'll see on the AP test, but you might also see a couple more. So you might want to check out norepinephrine, GABA, and glutamate. I don't have time to go into those, but if you want to be really careful about what's on the AP test, you should check those three out. On my test, we'll focus on those first four. So these things are in the synapse. That's where the neurotransmitters are doing their work. And we need to know in more detail what happens there. So in that picture, remember the neurotransmitter is being released in the synapse, and then it's binding to the receptor site. So there's a couple things that can happen with that process. One is that a substance can come into the synapse and imitate a neurotransmitter. So if it imitates it, if it's a molecule that looks just like the neurotransmitter molecule, maybe one slight little difference, then it might do what the neurotransmitter normally does. So these things are called agonists. Agonist. That's a weird word, but that's what it means. The substances that imitate. Wow, this video is getting a little bit longer than I thought. Okay. So heroin is an example of an agonist. Heroin is an endorphin agonist. It imitates endorphins. So when people take heroin, it's putting the substance into the synapse, and it's imitating an endorphin. And endorphins make you feel good. So people, when they use heroin, they feel really good. That's why they do it. By the way, there's a really bad side effect for people who use heroin is that the body stops producing endorphins, or it decreases the level at which it produces them. And when it does that, you don't feel good. So people have serious withdrawals connected with heroin because their body stops producing the natural neurotransmitter. That's why recovery from heroin withdrawal is painful, and it takes a long time for the body to start making them again. Okay, another thing that can happen in the neurotransmitter is that when in the synapse is when the neurotransmitter comes down and it's going to bind, a substance might block that binding. So something might get into the receptor site and block the neurotransmitter, and that type of substance is called an antagonist. Okay, it blocks it. Just like in a play or in a movie where the antagonist tries to block the protagonist from doing what he wants. The last thing that can happen there, or I should say the third thing that I'm going to tell you about, has to do with this process of reuptake. So reuptake is in this middle slide. When a neurotransmitter comes down in the synapse, there's a lot of extra neurotransmitter there. So some of it binds to the receptor sites, and some of it gets reabsorbed into the original sending neuron. So when it gets reabsorbed, it's called reuptake. Okay? And with reuptake, there are some substances that can block the reuptake of a neurotransmitter. So for instance, in this picture, you see the drug Prozac, which is an antidepressant. It blocks the reuptake of serotonin. So serotonin helps lift your mood a little bit. So if you block the reuptake, then you have more serotonin in the synapse, and your mood is going to be lifted. Okay? So Prozac is what they call an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it inhibits the reuptake. So it's an SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Okay, another reuptake inhibitor would be Ritalin. So a lot of you guys have heard about Ritalin. People take it for ADHD. Ritalin is, let's see, Ritalin is a reuptake inhibitor for norepinephrine and dopamine. Cocaine is also a reuptake inhibitor. It's a reuptake inhibitor for dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Okay, so what's going on in the synapse? We can imitate a neurotransmitter, that's called an agonist. We can block a neurotransmitter, that's called an antagonist. Or we can block the reuptake, that's a reuptake inhibitor. So an agonist would be heroin. Reuptake inhibitors would be Prozac, Ritalin, and cocaine. Okay, there's obviously a lot more than that. Like I said, it's really more complex than what I'm describing, but we're just giving you sort of the simplified version. It's all we need to know for AP Psych. And this should be really good for the AP test as well. So let's see if I had anything else. That's it. Sorry this was a little bit longer than I thought, a little longer than usual, but I think it's important to understand that process and what's going on in the synapse, because that's where a lot of stuff happens. Any rate, thanks for tuning in again today, and if you have any questions, you can see me in class, or, well, no, that's it. You can see me in class. All right, bye-bye.